Welcome to another episode of Grafted, Jewish Roots of Christianity. I'm your host, Stephanie Pavlantos. So today I have two people that I've had on before, and they're both great guests. I've had them on individually, but tonight we have a special treat. I have Ryan White and Dr. Dinah Dye, and thank you for being here. I appreciate you guys coming on. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Pleasure to be here.
So we have an interesting topic to talk about tonight. And just so everyone knows, I'm going to leave a lot of show notes because I want people to be able to visit their websites, and just to give them a few of their websites. So Ryan he is the voice and vision of faith of Messiah. Make sure I got that right. And he is the founder of the Saturday Church Community. And then Dr. Dinah Dye is an author, and they both have tremendous websites full of information. And she's had a lot of books out, but the three that are kind of, I guess, for me, that I know best about are the Temple Revealed books. So she has the Temple Revealed in creation, in the Garden, and in the Garden of Eden, and then in Noah's Ark, I believe. Those are the three. So she holds courses and everything on those books, so feel free to check them out as much as you like. And so tonight we are going to talk about Revelation Unmasked, and big book, lots of different views, but they are going to talk about it in such a way that we look at it through Hebrew eyes. So I'm excited. I know I was telling you that my introduction, besides all the pastors I've had who have spoken on Revelation or taught on Revelation, was the Left Behind series. I got a lot of my, biblical understanding of Revelation from that long ago. But over the last couple of years, I've seen it differently, and some of it may kind of shake people up. You may not agree. So let's just jump right in. Ryan, I'll start with you, and then that way we can just kind of go back and forth. But what do you think is one of the biggest parts of Revelation that we need to understand? Like, what would you say first? I know there's probably hundreds, but what would you say, like, first we should learn about?
I think that, and I would say this honestly about every book of the Bible, is that we need to learn what the word genre means and what genre the book of Revelation is. Right. There's so many times that you hear something being used and you're just like, do you understand what they mean? And I think we get it sometimes. Like, we talk about Paul's letters. Those were epistolary letters. That's the genre. It's a communication to someone that we're reading, and we understand that when we read his writings that he's responding to something else in the community, and if we want to understand what he's saying, we do that. You also think about the Psalms. The Psalms are not the same genre as the Torah, and we can't read something in the Psalms and say, oh, this is a commandment from God at the same level as what you might find in the Torah, because if you did that, you might come to the conclusion, for example, in Psalm 137, that you would be blessed if you killed babies, because that's in the Psalms. But if you understand the genre of it being someone crying out in anguish, then it's not misunderstood. But when it comes to Revelation, we seem to apply this or miss genre completely, and oftentimes we are taught to read it as literally as possible, and we're taught to read it as if the original audience looked at it, said, this makes no sense, let's just throw this in the back of our Bible, right? We were taught to read it as if the people receiving this letter, which it was a letter to 7 churches, had no idea what it meant. And so that's where I would really start off. And if I could throw one more thing in there, it would be when we see visions in the Bible. A vision is you could kind of think of as kind of like a genre. How are we supposed to interpret those? Well, we can turn to Acts chapter 10 and see how people in the Bible interpreted visions. Peter receives this vision of kill and eat all these things, and he doesn't go, well, I should apply this literally if possible, and start picking up all of the bugs on the road and shoving them in his mouth.
Yeah.
He understands that a vision is not supposed to be interpreted literally, that it's symbolic, and that you have to contemplate it. But I think we've missed that connection. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's real key, the genre aspect. What is the literary genre? You got to start with that. And in fact, Revelation has quite, we think of it as apocalyptic literature. And Ryan just mentioned the epistles. But within and of course, most people would see it as prophecy. But also within that, we have like oracle and wisdom. Like all of these things are within the Revelation book. And you really have to start there. And I won't repeat what Ryan said, but for me, one thing I want to say first is that, we don't know everything. We both done quite a bit of research. We investigate, we might have a hypothesis, and then we draw conclusions. And that's really what everyone should be doing. We'd like to give everybody permission to think critically about the book and challenge your current perspective and reconsider your sort of entrenched views of the book, just to step back. I personally stepped away from even reading the book for about 10 years because I couldn't get out. I felt like I was like a rat on a wheel. And when I went back to it 10 years later, after I had gained more understanding in other areas, I was just amazed. So not that I necessarily recommend that, but it's a good thing to step away from it and then go back with new eyes. I think for me, and this is maybe more of a recent understanding, is seeing the book more as historical prophecy than future prophecy. And that's a hard thing. And that requires you knowing your text, because we know the folks, the audience of the first century knew their text inside and out. They didn't have it written. They had it in their head. So if something was said, they kind of understood where it was and the context of it. So knowing your text, knowing your history, and we'll talk some about that as well, and appreciating that Revelation is taking us back really all the way to Genesis, but understanding that historical prophecy, and it's not telling us, I hesitate to even make the statement, but it's really not speaking of things in the year 2525, if you know what I mean.
Right. And I should mention that this comes from a video series you've done, or was it video, audio, both?
Yep,
maybe?
Yeah.
Video. Yep.
Okay. So called Revelation Unmasked. And you can actually go to revelationunmasked.com and find their sources and information and a lot of information about this. This is an 11-hour video series.
Yep.
So pretty in-depth, I would imagine. So I didn't get to listen to it all. And it's on, is it on both your sites or just Ryan's site?
No, it's on both. Yeah.
Okay.
We have it. Yeah, I mean, it's long, but it's really even not that in-depth in some ways, because we couldn't go verse by verse.
Right.
So we took big chunks and big themes and talked about that. I mean, it would have been like 65 hours, I think.
Yeah, that's true.
Easily.
That's true. Yeah. Well, so dispensationalism and is probably the most popular view that most of the church has been raised with. And I heard you talk about dispensationalism. So if one of you want to explain what it is and where it came from and why we still hold to that view.
Yeah. So dispensationalism, sometimes you might hear it referred to as futurism. It's a viewpoint that we are told that we should read as much as possible, read the Bible as being future to us today. And the term dispensationalism comes from the need that the people saw to have to separate God's way of behaving into dispensations, because they see in the gospel you have this loving Messiah who's forgiving everyone. He's saying, don't fight, love your enemies, lay down your life. And then they turn to the book of Revelation. They ignore, of course, the slain lamb, and they just focus in on all of the blood and the battles, and they put those all in God's hands, killing people. And so, of course, now you have, well, how do you deal with loving Jesus and wrathful God at the end of the book? And they say, well, God must, flip his way of doing things. This really became popular, what was it, around the early 1700s, 1800 in England, or it started out there. And then it comes to America right around the time of the Civil War, right when you have people who are just, in the midst of hell. And they're bringing this message that, that there's this idea of the rapture and all of these things. And of course, it's going to catch on to people who are living in this sort of thing. It gets written into our Bibles. The Schofield Study Bible, for example, puts a lot of notes. And then all of those headings that you see, like the chapter heading or the section heading, that we just assume was part of the original, manuscript.
Right.
No,
right.
That was all put in there by dispensational authors, and we don't recognize how much it influences how we understand those sections. And so that's really how it's carried over into America, where it's wildly popular, whereas the rest of the Christian world, the dispensational viewpoint is not anywhere near as popular in the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, these are, and they divide everything up into ages. So you have like all these different ages, right, varying degrees of how many years.
Into the church,
typically 1,000, right, per, and different things happen. And I think that's another attempt to put the book into a theological box so that it all is packaged very nicely. And it also is problematic because it also encourages looking at the book literally instead of recognizing sort of apocalyptic nature and the symbols and the metaphors and the figurative speech in there. I think it does a great disservice. That viewpoint does a great disservice in reading the book. But it's entrenched, and even in our so-called Hebrew roots Messianic world, I've seen a couple of videos online, and that's where it all ends up. And so we hope people will step back and just view the book in the context it was written and stop trying to make it fit in a box.
Mm-hmm. And Dinah, your books, especially the going back to Genesis, and I've heard you say, unless you understand the first 10 or 11 chapters of Genesis, you really can't understand as well the rest of the Bible, because you have to understand the beginning before you get to the end. And so I know that even within Genesis, it talks about the days of the end, or I forget how it's put exactly, but can you address that a little bit? Or
well, I don't want people to think, if you don't understand deeply Bible, somehow you're missing the boat, because the Bible serves a purpose. It ministers to the heart for, whatever purpose and need and time you're going through. But as far as, we've got, I guess we have it in a bit of a different category, as we are researching. We are studying and researching and trying to pull out. I just felt if you understood Genesis 1 through 11, basically you've got all the key themes and principles and, right there. It's just all set the foundation for the rest of the scriptures. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find anything that doesn't really fit into the sort of view of those 11 chapters. And so, after I finished the Noah book, I thought, well, I guess I'm done. Although now I'm considering maybe I need to write one, the temple revealed in Revelation. I don't know, there's a mouthful. Yeah. So really even going to Genesis 1, I mean, the entire framework of what's going to take place throughout the Bible, the pattern can even be found in the very first chapter of the Bible. And we really don't have time to go into a whole lot of it, but, to me, it makes the most sense. And then you just see the threads all through the Bible. It's again, that context of historical prophecy of going back and seeing, where was the foundation in order to be able to go forward?
Good point. So what about the rapture? So I know that's a big subject that people like to talk about, and many people are pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, no trib at all. I mean, there's people all over and with all different beliefs. And so where do you even start? And then, of course, I've also heard rapture's not in the Bible, and I know it's more of a Latin word. It came from Latin. It's not a Hebrew word. So how do you address that when people start asking you about rapture and when and how and what does it look like? So Ryan, maybe you can address that first.
Yeah, it's hard to address that without addressing the larger book for sure. And I guess first off, I would mention that this rapture, where that concept comes from, is not even in the book of Revelation.
Right.
This comes from people essentially kind of treating the Bible as a choose your own adventure book and like pulling out little bits here and there that are completely out of, like they ignore what Thessalonians, for example, which is where we get the rapture statement, is trying to convey to what Paul's trying to convey to the audience, and they just rip this little piece out and try to band-aid it in over there. It's the same thing, like, people talk about the Antichrist. Well, the Antichrist never appears in the Bible to begin with. There are Antichrists, and the word Antichrist never even appears in the book of Revelation.
Right.
But to talk about the so-called rapture, when Paul talks about this, he's talking about meeting the Lord in the air, and he's using this language that was just extremely common to the people at the time. They understood what he was saying. Whenever a Caesar would come to a city, what would happen is the people would see him coming with this, and he would come with an entourage, and they'd see these clouds of dust being kicked up. And the city would send out a delegation to meet Caesar and escort him to the city. And it's the same thing that we see, when Paul's talking about this. He's talking about, when Yeshua returns, we will meet him in the air, but where is he going? He's coming here. It's we're going up as a delegation to escort the king into the city, back to the earth. So that entire line of thought just kind of makes me laugh a little bit, when just how much when we're disconnected just from some simple cultural elements,
right, that
we just end up making up things because we don't grasp even some of the more simple aspects of life in the ancient Near Eastern world. And it's not our fault, right? It's just we've just been disconnected from it, and we tend to focus on all the wrong things.
Well, back to taking everything literally. So, I mean, another whole section we can talk about is just the context, the historical context. So for me, there's like three main areas that we don't spend any time on. Imperial cult is absolutely crucial to understand. The Oracle at Delphi, important, which actually can be traced back to the period of Mount Sinai, if you can imagine that.
Wow.
And also the cult at Ephesus, and especially if we're going to look at Asia Minor and the book of Revelation, like this is just absolutely critical. So what Ryan everything will fit if you learn the culture and context of the ancient Roman world. It's the same thing with the second coming. The Caesar would return his second coming back to a city to check on the folks to make sure that his money was well spent. If, for example, there'd been an earthquake, he would visit and he would provide them with the funds they needed to rebuild the city. And then he would come back a second time to make sure they did what they were supposed to do and that the city had been rebuilt and it was glorious and in honor of him and things like that. So, taking the rapture, again, I agree with Ryan. It's really not our fault. We spend very little time understanding the ancient world. And if you go and listen to these videos, we trace the whole sort of history of where the rapture came from. I don't want to really go into that, but it really is sort of a product, once again, of the 1800s. Dispensationalism and the rapture concepts seem to all come in around the same time. And then it went into the Schofield Bible and eventually into the Moody Sunday School, and then pretty soon it jumped into, what's his name?
Pop culture.
LaHaye and
Tim LaHaye.
And what's the other guy already from the 70s? Hal Lindsey.
Right.
Right. So all of that, and then we take it as gospel, and we don't even know where it started. So we are really obsessive compulsive about you learning as much as you possibly can about the period in which we're talking about, which we may want to address the dating thing of Revelation.
Yeah, go
because
ahead.
that's another area. Ryan, you want to start, or I'll
address whatever you like?
Oh,
because most of us
okay.
have learned, or at least, you know, I myself, I guess I can speak for 98, you know, or, you know, before the turn of the century there, or turn of, I guess, century, what, 100 years.
Yeah.
But yeah, right around that time is what I've always heard.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different, or you know, I guess there's probably two main lines of thought. There's one that says it was around 60 AD, and usually that's what's called the preterist camp, who believe that it was predicting the future of 70 AD. And oftentimes in the more orthodox of preterism, they say, well, it was predicting the war of 70 AD, and therefore it's not really relevant anymore. The other camp is that it was written later on, and at around 90-ish AD. And oftentimes that is so that they can say, well, see, it clearly wasn't about 70 AD. My personal opinion, having studied as much as I can about this for quite a while, is that it was indeed written in the 90s. And there's a lot of evidence pointing to, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember the name, the Caesar. Domitian, yeah. There's a lot of evidence pointing to him, and I mean, just a ton of stuff that really points to him being the focal point here of some of the things. But that doesn't mean it's not about 70 AD. This is one of those things, when you understand apocalyptic Jewish literature in that time period, it would oftentimes be written retrospectively, and it would be written as if it was written before then. You know, you have even in Revelation where it talks about a man-child being born. Well, that's clearly talking about Yeshua being born, and yet it's using a future tense. And I've seen some crazy stuff out there, like people believing their child is the man-child of Revelation, and they've got a whole website you can go donate to, right?
Wow.
But that was how they did it. They would write as if they were back then, and they're writing about 70 AD, but they're writing about it not because they're trying to predict it. They're trying to reveal God's perspective to people who have gone through that and are asking the question, why? Why did God allow this to happen? They're trying to call people out of their sorrow from that, and also from their slumber, because 20 years later, there's a lot of people who had moved on, and they're cozying up to the Romans. And now, you know, John is trying to wake them up and say, look, the system that you think is great, that's providing you with iPhones and MacBook Pros and, you know, all the latest, greatest toys, it's a beast system. It's built on the blood of saints. It's the system that murdered our Messiah. Wake up. Look at what the cost is.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, the key in all of it is bringing hope, and then equipping the community to kind of resist the empire, the impression of the empire that's coming against them. But really, if you look at the Bible, I mean, the Gospels were not written when the Gospels were taking place. They were written later. And so whenever you write something later, you have a different perspective, and you insert that in. You can't help it. When I wrote my books, you know, now I wish I'd added all this other stuff, but when I wrote them, you know, it was sort of after the fact for some things. And so I gave it a perspective that I wouldn't have had if I was experiencing it in real time. And so, as Ryan said, and I totally agree with this, after much reading and, you know, deciphering, that it was probably written in the early 90s there at that period, but it was written about the time, the Jewish revolt leading up to 70 Common Era. And that, in my opinion, you know, all of the concepts about the Great Tribulation and et cetera had to do with that particular period of time, because Great Tribulation was indeed coming on them in a way they had not experienced really since the Babylonian attack on the temple and all that sort of thing. They were going to experience the exact same thing of losing their identity and their culture and their history and everything. Everything was going to be stripped away. And so it was going to be a shaking, the likes of which they had not experienced in, you know, whatever, 600 or 700 years. So it seems it makes sense. And I would say too that apocalyptic literature is very traditionally what we might call resistance literature. And I think one of the main messages that Yeshua is, he's pushing back against the culture.
Right.
I mean, in such a sly way, so many times you're like, wow, he kind of got that in there, didn't he? And he's pushing back against Rome. He's pushing back against the Herodian dynasty, and he's pushing back against the temple, the corruption of the temple at that particular time. So all of these themes end up in the book of Revelation, because John is well familiar, if in fact he's the one that wrote it, was quite familiar with all of this.
Right. So what about Daniel and Revelation? How do you, I mean, obviously there's parallels within the books about the beasts and being described in the same ways. And so how do you address that, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think John has a vision, right? And he's not writing his vision down word for word. He's free and free, inspired by the Spirit, obviously, but he's using his own words and his own reference points to describe his vision. And so while he never quotes anywhere, there's not a single quote in the book of Revelation, he clearly uses the entire Old Testament and especially certain books as a canvas to paint upon, if you will. And so he is very heavily drawing on the book of Daniel and these visions. And one thing that I thought was just so important that was pointed out is that Daniel is told to seal, and I'm gonna paraphrase here, seal up the vision, for the time is far off, something to that effect. While John, when he's told about this, he's told the time is near.
Yes.
So if we do a little bit of calculator math here, Daniel is being written somewhere around maybe 500 years before.
Mm-hmm.
We're now 2,000 years after the book of Revelation. So if the time was further off for Daniel than it was for John, it kind of throws a whole wrench in the idea that John was writing about sometime 2,000 years in the future. I believe what John is saying is that he's seeing these. He's saying we are seeing these beast systems. And I do want to call this out, because I think this is important, because sometimes there's this like, oh, well, you just believe it's all done away with and it's not relevant. No, that's not what we're saying. This is extremely relevant for today, because we have that phrase, history repeats itself. The patterns of evil repeat themselves. And so what Daniel was calling out in his day was the corruption of empire. What John was calling out in his day was the corruption of empire. Guess what? We're seeing the same corruption. There's one of the books on the list, it's called Unveiling Empire. It just blew me away, because this was a book that was written like 25 years ago. And they were just calling out all of these beast-like things that the United States and especially big corporations in the United States were doing in South America. Mm-hmm. And they basically said, what this is going to, I mean, if we understand Revelation, this is going to result in people moving into cities in South America, and that's going to result in crime and drugs, and it's going to result in people fleeing South America. And I'm like, reading this, I'm like, wait a minute, there's a border crisis going on right now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not, we're not saying that the book of Revelation, what we're saying is it's not predicting specific events in the future.
Right.
But it is showing us what the patterns and the results of participating in beast systems will do, regardless of what time period you live in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you can definitely see parallels between the United States and Rome. I mean, there's definite parallels that we have, and you can't deny those parallels. And so, well,
the nature of empire never changes. Mm-hmm. And so when Yeshua comes, he is resisting it, and he is presenting a path that's 180 degrees opposite of how empire operates. And so there's debate too about when Daniel was written. A lot of scholars now think somewhere 120, 130 BCE. Clearly the book is about a period, once again, going back, historical prophecy, going back to the period of the Babylonians and the Persians and the Medes and the Greeks. And of course, they're all identified with animals, which is very natural. The ancient world, they always identified their empires with an animal, a lion or, whatever. And interestingly enough, in the ancient world, kings and their empires were always, the kings were called hunters, and that they hunted men. And so they were very much tied. So this beast language, I mean, we can go back to Genesis, okay? And we talk about the Leviathan and the dragon and the serpent and the whatever, always connecting to empire, because like it or not, the Bible really is a very political book, because we see Israel constantly under the thumb of an empire. And how do we, it speaks to us directly. How do we live under empire? And now we very much recognize we live under the American empire. And so how do we resist? How do we walk? What is the path? And then Yeshua just outlines that in the Sermon on the Mount and shows us the way through. And, and Daniel very much, is showing us the past, the patterns, and how kingdoms and empires operate. And then John is clearly picking up all of that language because they're dealing with exactly the same thing.
Wow. Yeah, that's true. And then in my recent studies, Joel talks about locusts and kind of, and even like these beasts and stuff, that it's the same colors, the same color combinations that like Revelation talks about. And then, like you said, I mean, even Job mentions different things, and even Abaddon, who's mentioned in Revelation. So we see a lot of parallels in different books. And I think even Leviticus kind of even outlines the 4 horsemen that are in Revelation 6, because you can see the same outline of these different famine and deceiving and different things that are happening. And I forget what chapter it was, but
Leviticus. Well, Zachariah is like a roadmap. I mean, read that. The similarities and the things that are drawn out, that John has gone back to Zachariah and pulled out. And then we don't even know how to read Zechariah. Like, we've got it in all this sort of weird future stuff, making it once again fit in a box without putting it in its proper context on who the high priest was and the governor and all that, which I don't want to go off into that. But just, I mentioned, knowing these books, the way they knew the books. And then they would know, like, if John was quoting it and he kind of misquoted it, okay, what does that mean? Like, we wouldn't know if John misquoted anything unless we could, read it and compare it line by line, word by word. And we go, oh, why? Why did he add in that phrase? But if we just kind of hear it, we don't even have a clue. But they would have known this. And so, that would cause them, to think, okay, what is he saying here? How is he interpreting this? And again, taking us back to a place of building the community so that the community has hope to overcome and not compromise and assimilate into this beast culture.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, I can't emphasize that enough, that it's about resistance. It's about following the Lamb and the Lamb's way of doing things, not the empire's.
Yeah.
And we've turned it into not the revelation of Jesus, but the revelation of the Antichrist.
Yeah.
I saw a post and it just made me sad. The red heifer stuff is, of course, popping its head up again. And someone commented under it of like, oh, I can't wait for them to build the temple. The Antichrist is coming soon! !
Wow.
And I'm like,
that's not who we're focusing
we're
on.
excited about, about the coming of I mean, not that I even believe that that's what that's going to trigger or anything, but like, we've missed the boat. The Bible calls us to be the kingdom. The Bible, Jesus didn't come and teach how to be good people so that he could just come back and destroy it all and start over again. Like, we're called to be a force of good in the world. And this is my problem with the dispensational doctrine is it teaches us to not care and to actually cheer on evil at times, because that means that Jesus is coming soon.
Yeah, and I think I don't know. I mean, again, there's lots of different point of views, and I've read books, on all different points of view. And there is talk, like in Revelation 14, about the harvest and different harvests that are happening. And one is a good harvest, one's, definitely a bad harvest, the wine press and the blood and all of that. But it's really confusing when you try to read and try to learn about that, and you want to understand it better, but you have so many different points of view. And I guess in some ways, none of us really know 100%. We can't say 100% any one thing, but we have to use the whole Bible as evidence and go back to other scriptures and just constantly keep looking at it through the lens of the Jewish people and the people who understood what he was talking about. So I guess it's just a challenge to everyone to do that. Like you said, you mentioned earlier, Dinah, just to forget what you've learned and reread it with different eyes and try to piece different books, sayings and the way that they think in different books of the Bible, not different books in the world, but
well, there's a lot of scholars have written quite a number of books on this period of time, and I really encourage people and go through we'll have on our website, there's a list, a research list. There's like 30 different sources that we used. And just kind of, if you are interested, kind of immerse yourself in that period of history. That'll be just transformative. Even in the Gospels, we see Yeshua, addressing things that has to do with ancient Rome, but we don't recognize it because we're unfamiliar. For example, just using the term Son of God, that was a title. It was referring to Caesar in that context, but it's a title of a king god going back to ancient Mesopotamia. And we miss it. So I really want to encourage people just to start reading the history. And find, you don't have to go read some 700-page history book, but just there's some really good, easy ones to read and get familiar and get the flavor of the context and the history of that time. It's so important to understand the imperial cult of Rome. I can't even, it's just critical. And I think when people do that, I think a lot of these things that we're so confused about will go away. Not everything. But, I think it will make more sense.
Well, I'm trying to think of a really good question because I'm not sure if I know how to ask, but basically when we get to the Millennial Kingdom, we get to the end of time type of thing where we usher in, the Lord ushers in the Millennial Kingdom. What kind of leads up to that, if that's the right way to put it? What leads up to the Millennial Kingdom as far as what we've been taught, as opposed to really what it looks like? I don't know. Do you understand my question?
You want to start, Ryan? I'll clean up your mess.
Put on my heretic hat here. I'm going to preface this by saying I used to be really big into all of this. I used to connect, Ezekiel 40 through 48. And there's some weird stuff out there of, there'll be people who are immortals and non-immortals, or I've heard all sorts of just interesting ideas. Throughout the book of Revelation, numbers are symbolic. I'll start there. So I don't think that there's some 1,000-year period, and it's only mentioned this like one time in there, and I think that we're reading into that a lot. Where I like to actually go towards is really talking about the city that we see at the end. That's the goal. And what's the best way to explain this without sounding too bad? First off, I fully believe that Yeshua will return, that there is a resurrection, that there is immortality. That being said, I don't believe that the book of Revelation is trying to paint a literal picture of what that looks like. A big part of my job is process improvement for a hospital system. And if you want to process improve, you have to give people a vision of what tomorrow can be. You have to give them a vision of like, this is what we're aiming towards. This is the goal that we're working towards. And then they have to understand how they fit towards that. So when I look at that end time description, it's an absurd city, right? It's a city that if you were to measure it out, there's been some pictures like it's like a third the size of the moon. It, you know, if as long as we're still on a globe Earth, if it was a square, the gates would be 15 miles in there. There's all sorts of, I mean, it's crazy big. And it's actually almost exactly, depending on how long a stadia is, there's different stadias. It's almost exactly the distance between Jerusalem and Rome.
Okay.
That size. I don't believe that that's talking about a literal city. I believe that because throughout the Bible, the people of God are described as a city. Yep. Jerusalem speaks of not just the city, but of the people. And I believe that when we read this book, it's talking about how we are called to be and what we will eventually be. It's a city that there's no darkness in, that the light of God is always there. There's no need for a physical temple because the Lamb is our temple. God dwells within us. That was the purpose of the temple. It's a city that's gates are never shut. I love that picture. The gates are never shut, meaning there's always an open invitation. But you notice that in chapter 22, it says, but outside are the dogs and the sorcerers and the people who practice evil. Why are they outside the city? The gates are open. They could go in whenever they want, but they could not exist in the light of God in the way that they're behaving. So how I look at that as is, yes, one day we will be resurrected, yet one day God will physically, literally dwell with us, whatever that means. But in the meantime, that's what we're called to be. We're called to always to be a community that's always open, and we're not scared of the darkness. We're not scared of the people who are living counter to what we believe in, whether that's sexual preference or whatever, coming into our congregation and sitting with us and fellowshipping with us, because we infect them with the light. They don't infect us with the darkness. And we recognize that the light will always drive out the darkness. So that's how I approach that concept of the millennium.
Yeah.
Which doesn't answer the question, but gives a response.
No, I understand. It's
not
probably
really
just very different.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Brian said, I mean, it's basically not even mentioned in the Bible, and we've managed to create books upon books and theology upon theology. And I've wrestled with this a lot, because when I went back to Revelation, I said, okay, how do I see this now, because I've had a break. So to me, and this is just my opinion for what it's worth, I feel that it is as a message of returning back to the garden, that the concept of millennial, even though we give it the 1,000 years, in Hebrew, it talks about 1,000 years as a day kind of thing. A yom echad, which you find in Zachariah, one day is as, I see it defined as eternity. It's an eternal event. And that the kingdom is eternal, and the kingdom is an overlay of the natural world, if you will. I mean, you have empire and you have kingdom, and there's an overlay of the two, if that makes any sense. And so I just see that message, that picture, as here now, that Yeshua is king, he's on the throne, the reign is here, and that it's not a literal, amount of time. And that's what the dispensationalists did. They took 1,000 years and kept mapping it out till you got to 7,000 years.
Right.
And as Brian said, the message of the garden, although given to Adam, who was kind of the representative king in that space, but it was that for all his image bearers throughout all of eternity, throughout all of the history of time. And so again, this city isn't a literal city, but representing all of humanity who is in covenant with the God of the universe. And that there are people still who've chosen not to be in covenant, and they're the ones outside the city gates. But it is that welcoming in for all, whosoever. And the other thing I feel in the Messianic Hebrew roots movement is we've kind of forgotten our mission as image bearers to the quote, not unquote, Gentiles, the non-Jews. And we've insulated ourselves, and we're in this little city and we shut the door and we don't want anyone else in, or we don't think they should be able to come in because they don't whatever look like us, act like us, or whatever. But it always goes back to that covenant relationship. And so, that's our mission. That's our task, is to show people the way, the protocol to meet with God and become part of the covenant people. So that's where I've landed on that topic.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's been insightful. I know there's lots of different, like we introduced it, there's lots of different
for sure
ideas and ways of explaining everything. And I've read books from Messianic rabbis, I've read all sorts of stuff, and and it seems sometimes as if it doesn't matter what book you open, you're going to have an additional view of something, yes. A different view than the last book I read. You've given us a lot to think about. You have to explore. You have to read yes. deeper than just taking everyone's opinion on everything you've ever been taught, and just going through scripture and seeing what holds water and what doesn't, and yeah, you make a great point that there are words that we use that aren't necessarily in the Bible the way that we use them. There's allusion, there's things about a temple, another temple being talked about in Ezekiel. Do they call it the Messianic temple, or is that just like one of those headers? Because see, they run together for me, even like the headers of over different chapters,
right?
They kind of just, they get in there and they make you think, oh, okay, this is what it's about. So yeah, you give me a lot.
Yeah, there's an underlying assumption that that's some future temple when the book itself never makes that claim.
Does not.
Yeah. Well, but we do know that Yeshua is our temple. He will always be the temple, and like Revelation does state that he's the temple and no more sun. But yeah, maybe we can pick up this some other time and talk about more. Certainly a really in-depth, that 45-50 minutes doesn't do it justice, but I do appreciate you being on and talking about it this much. So hopefully we can get together and do it again. So thank you.
Absolutely. Hopefully we hit the high points for people. Yeah. And again, they don't have to agree at all. Our goal is just to challenge you to think differently about the text than you have.
Absolutely. And your resources, let me just give that address again. It's at Revelation Unmasked, ed at the end.com.
Correct.
So they can go there and visit your resources and all of that.
And they can feel free to email us with any questions they have. I'm always available to answer whatever is the best I need.
You are. I have text her messages on Facebook Messenger and just said, "Can you help me? I have to talk about this. I need some insight." So thank you. You are very available. So I do encourage people to ask questions and don't get all mad about if it's different than what you believe. It's just
don't defellowship over it.
Yes, please don't do that. Don't send them evil texts. So, so thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure, our pleasure.